Video games are an international phenomenon. That's true not only in the sense that they're regularly enjoyed by more than 1 billion players around the globe, but also in the sense that they are profoundly international. I've got games on my phone, my computer, or my bookshelf right now that are created in Canada, Germany, Japan, Poland, South Africa, South Korea, the United Kingdom, the United States, Uruguay, and more. Yet despite this geographic diversity, the games themselves are seldom readily identifiable as products of any particular location. That's by design. Developers often eliminate or minimize region-specific identifiers through a process called localization. During localization, aspects of a game are adapted to fit the perceived cultural norms and preferences of a target market. The most obvious part of localization is the linguistic translation of game text, but the process often involves a wide range of alterations to game content as well, including music. Although localization as a whole has been the subject of a significant amount of research, music has typically been left out of the discussion. In the same way, game audio research, including my own, has more or less just ignored the issue of localization. I believe bridging this gap is long overdue, and so this brief presentation outlines a possible framework for categorizing musical localization, with the goal of encouraging an understanding of game music as a product of place. I suggest we can start that process by borrowing 3 categories of localization commonly used in the industry: basic localization, complex localization, and blending. As its name implies, basic localization is the most straightforward option. Only essential information is localized, so there are few or no musical changes. Game companies might opt for basic localization as a way to save money, or it might be a conscious decision to emphasize rather than downplay specific cultural markers. The next type is complex localization. Here, culture-specific markers are removed or altered to make a game seem internationalized or universal. That could involve minor changes to music to suit target demographics, or composers adopting less regionally identifiable compositional styles. The final type of localization is blending, which involves major changes to a game's content or gameplay. Here, the music might be significantly or completely altered for international release, stripping the game of sonic markers of cultural identification and replacing those markers with something else. That might include rewriting, removing, or replacing a significant amount of in-game audio. To show how this 3-part model might apply to game music in practice, let me offer a brief example of each type. So we can compare apples to apples, all my examples focus on one common localization path: adapting Japanese games for the North American market. Localization is usually about making games feel local to each target region. Sometimes, however, developers might instead choose to actively reinforce a game's cultural origins for worldwide distribution, emphasizing rather than minimizing its otherness. That's certainly the case in the developer Namco's Katamari series, which began in 2004 with the PlayStation 2 title Katamari Damacy. In this aggressively quirky game, the player creates a series of ever larger clumps, or katamaris, by rolling up whatever happens to be around, starting with tiny objects and ending up with entire countries or even planets. There's nothing specifically Japanese about that narrative, but scholars including Mia Consalvo have suggested that the central activity of the game, collecting things, is a commentary on the somewhat obsessive collecting activities of otaku in Japan and likely elsewhere, thus drawing from Japanese culture for a central gameplay mechanic. Everything about Katamari Damacy exudes Japaneseness. Even the title resists translation. A transliteration of Katamari and Tamashi, clump and soul, the 2 kanji characters of the title, are prominently displayed even on the North American box art, which also depicts a rainbow above a giant katamari, a large city, presumably Tokyo, and Mount Fuji. The soundtrack of Katamari Damacy is just as obvious in its national origins. As Stephen Reale has argued persuasively in a study of the game's music, the Japanese culture of naive cuteness, or kawaii, is the prevailing visual and sonic aesthetic. To the best of my knowledge, the soundtrack is identical in Japanese and North American releases. It's an eclectic compilation of popular songs in various styles contributed by Japanese artists, loosely united by the frequent incorporation of the series' main theme. Limiting musical localization to the basic level helps keep the game situated as an explicitly Japanese cultural product. Uncommonly, for example, even in the North American releases, some of the lyrics remain in Japanese, or in a combination of Japanese and English, a constant sonic reminder of the music's place of origin. The next study of complex localization illustrates how Japaneseness can simultaneously be emphasized and minimized, presenting games as both regional and universal. Video game genres are typically identified by narrative content and by gameplay style, and not by geographic region of origin. There is one instance, however, where these concepts overlap: the Japanese role-playing game, or JRPG, which traces its origins back to 1980s titles like Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star, or Final Fantasy. There's a core expectation of Japaneseness in JRPGs, a sense that some part of the game's authenticity rests in their country of origin. At the same time, however, as JRPGs have become increasingly popular outside Japan, localization has focused on limiting identifiers of Japanese culture that might alienate Western audiences. In other words, JRPGs have to be both Japanese and universal. As a result, localizing these games can be challenging. The end result is often a complex localization, where some aspects of the plot or gameplay might be altered for international release beyond those essential for playability. The same is true of music. Let's consider the long-running Tales series of JRPGs, which includes a number of titles localized for North American markets. I would argue that there are, broadly speaking, two forms of musical localization at work in the Tales series, one obvious and one subtle. One of the most prominent and consistent features of the Tales games is a lengthy title cutscene in the style of an anime TV program. In Japan, the music for this sequence has typically been a pre-existing song by popular J-pop musicians or a group. For the first several games in the series, however, in the North American versions, these J-pop songs were replaced by new music from series composer Motoi Sakuraba, written in a style more like the in-game soundtrack. Consider the different intro sequences for Tales of Symphonia, one of the first major Tales games released in North America. The reason for this significant change boiled down to demographic targeting, as an FAQ article in the online game magazine IGN made clear. What's changed for the US build? In an effort to make Tales of Symphonia appeal to a US audience, developer Namco has taken several steps to make it a US product. The J-pop opening theme song has been replaced by an orchestral album. Next question, why did they change the opening theme? Namco felt that Tales of Symphonia's presentation was, quote, to Japanese, end quote. During the localization process, it made several changes to help Tales of Symphonia appeal to a U.S. audience. The first thing changed was the opening theme, which featured Starry Heavens by Day After Tomorrow. The new anthem was created by Motoi Sakuraba, who composed Tales of Symphonia's score. Swapping out the theme song was more than a musical afterthought. It was the first thing the localization team changed to make the game more appealing to a North American audience. Now, this soundtrack swapping is a fairly obvious form of musical localization. Much more subtle is the possible influence of what developers sometimes call internationalization, deliberately avoiding regional identifiers in the first place to avoid having to do much work with localization later on. With regards to character design, for example, Japanese game developers often adhere to the principle of mukokusuki, or statelessness, meaning that characters' ethnic identities are obscured. This ideology of cultural erasure has a notable impact on the reception and understanding of Japanese products and their localization. We can see here several examples of stateless character design from JRPGs. As the sociologist Koichi Iwabuchi observes, the international spread of mukokusuki popular culture from Japan simultaneously articulates the universal appeal of Japanese cultural products and the disappearance of any perceptible Japaneseness, which is subtly incorporated into the localization strategies of media industries. So back to music. As we've already heard, in some Tales games, Sakuraba wrote new title music when the J-pop original was considered too Japanese. But why was Sakuraba's music not also too Japanese? Was Sakuraba composing in a form of musical mukokusuki designed to avoid markers of its own Japaneseness? That's a tough question to answer. Yet Sakuraba's musical style and orchestration does seem for the most part calculated to avoid overt Japanese musical markers, and JRPGs as a genre have often borrowed from Western classical and cinematic music history. As Iwabuchi notes regarding stateless character designs, if it is indeed the case that the Japaneseness of Japanese animation derives from its erasure of physical signs of Japaneseness, is not the Japan that Western audiences are at long last coming to appreciate an animated, raceless, and cultureless virtual version of Japan? Applying this same critique to music, are the kinds of approaches that composers like Sakuraba employ in anticipating the preferences of North American audiences part of a larger pattern of cultural erasure? From that perspective, complex musical localization of this kind might take on a troubling aspect. In musical blending, the third type of localization, that erasure becomes almost complete. Here, Japanese soundtracks are either entirely or in large part replaced by different music for North American audiences. Blending is by far the most comprehensive type of localization. Entire narrative arcs might get scrapped, added, or rewritten. A character's design might be completely transformed, or an entirely new soundtrack might be provided. The purpose of blending is not always entirely clear beyond an attempt to correctly or incorrectly anticipate the preferences of a given audience. One well-known example of musical blending is the Gran Turismo series of racing simulators, which started in 1997. The first two games in this series had an original rock-influenced soundtrack in Japan, but international versions of the game used licensed pre-existing pop, rock, and electronica songs. As the musicologist Tim Summers explains regarding the original Gran Turismo, a definitive reason for this difference is elusive, but plausible factors include the commercial potential for Western pop music and that the original Japanese soundtrack in a 1980s rock style sounded unfashionably dated for a Western audience. Whatever the reason, clearly the game's developers believed having a soundtrack specifically targeted to Western tastes was important enough to justify the considerable expense of licensing music by artists like David Bowie, Blur, and the Dandy Warhols. Beginning in 2001 with Gran Turismo 3, the series adopted a different approach to musical localization and included both licensed popular music and original scores contributed by Japanese composers. Even with these shared soundtracks, however, there remains some significant musical differences, most notably in the opening video. In the case of Gran Turismo 3, the Japanese version features a new arrangement of Moon Over the Castle, the Gran Turismo theme song. But the North American release features a remix of the 1993 Lenny Kravitz song, Are You Gonna Go My Way? Later Gran Turismo games follow this trend, a universal soundtrack mixing original Japanese game music with Western, predominantly North American, popular music, but with demographically targeted intro videos. Gran Turismo's move away from fully blended soundtracks seems to coincide with a larger shift in mindset regarding musical localization after 2000, a questioning of whether extensive blending was really necessary to attract global audiences. Perhaps out of concerns about cultural stereotyping, or maybe a desire to avoid the labor and expense of creating multiple soundtracks, blended musical scores seem to be on the decline in favor of complex localization and composers aiming for musical statelessness. This three-part model can get us started, but it's only starting to scratch the surface. Indeed, the localization process can be far more multidirectional than my brief examples indicate. For example, sometimes Japanese games receive what's called a recursive import, a reverse localization of the North American version of an originally Japanese title, as in the Japan-only international versions of several Final Fantasy games in the 2000s. In those cases, a Japanese audience might consume, even prefer, music that was specifically altered from a Japanese soundtrack to appeal to an entirely different regional demographic. Musical localization poses some tough questions to the study of game music. When multiple soundtracks exist for all or part of a game, which one is the real one? Is it fair for scholars to give primacy to their local versions of games? And how can we even know what differences exist between games in the first place when it's difficult or impossible to obtain and play all the different regional variants? Despite all these challenges, engaging meaningfully with musical localization is vitally important. All musical works are products of place, and considering video game music as a cultural rather than as a universal product is fundamental to situating games and players alike in the context of the complicated, expansive, open world in which we live.